Welcome to the 70th episode of the interview series, a production of One Week Critique, an Iowa-based nonprofit organization that offers educational resources and editorial support to students and teachers of the literary arts. You can learn more about us and our programs or support our work by visiting our website, oneweekcritique.com. Please like and subscribe to help us continue providing excellent content. I'm Jon Riccio, joined today by Jane Miller, who has written more than a dozen books, most recently the poetry collection Paper Banners, Copper Canyon Press, 2023. She has performed her creative work and lectured on literature and the fine arts at universities, colleges, libraries, community centers, and public arts venues for over 30 years. She is the recipient of a Wallace Award, a Guggenheim Fellowship, two National Endowment for the Arts Fellowships, the Western States Book Award, and the Audre Lorde Award. Miller served as a professor for many years in the creative writing program at the University of Arizona, including a stint as its director and as a visiting poet at the University of Texas Mishner Center for Writers in Austin. Welcome, Jane.
Thank you, Jon. Pleasure to see you and to be here.
Always a pleasure. Now, I'm recalling when I have read your work, and this takes me back. I placed myself now in the spring of 2013. I'm reading Memory at These Speeds, new and selected poems, because I was going to attend University of Arizona in the fall. And I actually remember a cold February day. I am parked, I think, halfway in two different spaces in a credit union parking lot with a very, very low-tech flip phone. And you were calling to tell me that I was in the program, and I was just so excited that I actually forgot who I was speaking with. And I remember asking you to spell your name as if there were a way to spell Jane Miller in five different variations on it. And then I remember September 2013 reading Thunderbird because you had read it at the University of Arizona Poetry Center. Then Who is Trixie the Trasher and Other Questions. This was spring 2020 lockdown literature, and it's tied into this moment in my life when I'm teaching my first intro to poetry workshop. I was at the University of Southern Mississippi, the Centers for Writers, and
Mm.
it was just that pandemic time, and it was right on my bookshelf because I purchased it at Community of Writers in the summer 2019. So presently, I've got Paper Banners, and then Working Time, essays on poetry, culture, and travel. And this is all I'm juggling teaching and editing in the larger quest of writing. And it feels to me as if Kairos is waving at serendipity, that's waving to the grand piano, which is the opening poem in Paper Banners. And in this opening poem, this excerpt tells us of the housekeepers and gardeners burn the furniture outside the palace in golden light. The beekeepers weep over the last red milkweeds. The artists remove the scaffolding. Our job is brutal and necessary to be with the one we love and to think something in the heart weighs on the heart. How did task and necessity shape Paper Banners?
Well, you're listing off some interesting dates in our past together, and I'm thinking about the period of time right after I wrote Trixie the Trasher. COVID hit the world, and I, like most people, went into seclusion. And so I wrote Paper Banners mostly in the privacy of my own room, just reading and listening to music intermittently. Fortunately, I was living with my partner Valentina, so I wasn't as isolated as some people who were living alone. And we braved it together, but mostly we were, because she is also an artist, we were working separately in the house. And so that's how the book was written. And as a result, I think it's quieter than a lot of my earlier work because it was so quiet all around. And there's a thin stream of fear that goes through it, I think, that has obviously direct connection and consequence out of the horror that was going on regarding the illness and the lack of information about the illness. So those were the two things that were affecting me, both the silence and the terror of a pandemic.
Hmm. Well, when I think about also Chekhov Parks's Corvette, there are some parts where you write, irony can't cut it. Surrealism, I forgive you too. You haven't gone far enough. You can't get the guts spilled in the street back into the body, but prefer to serve it as sheep intestines for fine dining on Mars. You've gone too far from what the mind is for. And then we have a four-line poem, Pompeii, prefers the couch for a nap, poor self, ultimately neurotic and romantic, actually has lice. Snowboard on acid and you hit Sophocles. The pared down surrealness of Pompeii, it's an approach that I frequently use because I've been envisioning since 2020, right around the time of the pandemic, this new poetry movement called the confurial or confessional surrealism. And I'm just curious as to how you feel if
Mm.
surrealists are too grandiosity centric or if they're not stretching their banners far enough.
Oh, well, the issue of surrealism is a big one. As you know, there's a kind of European surrealism that affected American surrealism only so far. That is to say, when I was reading a lot of the East European surrealists, I realized that they were writing against a background that filtered through, of course, of murder and terror and fascism and conventionality in general. And so when I started reading a lot of American surrealists, it seemed like it at times could be quite thinly represented as a form in poetry, and it got kind of giddy in my imagination. And I'm not excluding myself from this. I think when I myself was using surrealism as a technique, I could be very flighty with it. I think it's really easy to just talk about candy canes floating through the universe and apples growing from people's ears, and it's a silly form on the surface of things, but when it attaches to uh, more serious realities, then surrealism can be very effective. And I suppose all of that writing came out of conversations that I had had back a few years when I was working at the Mishner Center in Austin, discussing and arguing with a friend of mine, Dean Young, about surrealistic techniques, because he was, if you know his work at all, and anybody who has access to our conversation might know his work well too. He could be at both extremes of surrealism. And so that was filtering through my mind as I was, and I mentioned this before, sitting in my room alone, thinking about, what kind of work do I want to do after writing so many books? Do I want to repeat myself? Do I want to, what do I want to do as an author
Mhm.
who loves to write? What were my intentions? And so I was really questioning some of the poetic techniques, even as I was thinking about using them, trying to be more conscious or even self-conscious about what I was doing as a writer. Because, after a certain number of books or even a certain number of poems, you have to think about what you're doing, not right at the onset, but later, maybe in the second draft. You have to really think about why am I writing this? What do I want to cut at the end that's pretty well done, but not how I want to be represented? So these are all thoughts that were going through my mind. I'm sorry about the background noise, but as I
Oh,
said
okay.
earlier to you when we were introducing each other yet again to one another, that I was parked in a parking lot because my house is being renovated. So I now notice that there's a giant truck backing up.
Is Chekhov Park next to you?
Yeah, you know what? When you talk about Chekhov, you never know what surreal thing is going to happen. But a couple of gentlemen are backing up their truck behind me. So yeah, this was a real dilemma for, not just for me, obviously, but for many writers who were thinking about technique as they move through either a narrative or a lyric poem or a poem that's more rhetorical. How do I want to express myself? So this all came out into my poetry.
Mhm. When you mentioned Dean Young, I remember The Art of Recklessness, one of his Grey Wolf book, and I read it in 2017. I brought it into that first creative writing
Yeah.
intro workshop with my poets in 2020. And I'm sort of paraphrasing from it. I think there's this line, just because a thing can't be done doesn't mean it can't be did, something along the lines of that. And that has always inspired me to think about just surrealism and
Well,
how,
Dean. Dean had a great sense of humor.
Mm.
Sorry.
And then I've thought other times this idea of confessional work with surrealism. It's kind of if you put Anne Sexton and sat her at the lunch table with James Tate, and what would their collaborative process look like? And it,
Yes, and just another remark about Dean regarding that. After he had some serious health issues, which eventually caught up with him, but his work became both very flighty and very seriously conventional and profound and tragic. So
mm,
I suppose he was really well aware of balancing that, and I think as he wrote more and more, he was even I guess, terrified of what he'd gone through. And so that filtered into his work in a confessional kind of way.
mm,
I hope we don't all have to go through health crises to figure out what kind of technique we want to use in poetry and what is its value. But he really got me thinking about, what is it that I want to do and how far do I want to go with it?
mm. Always good to keep in mind. I love that. This, how far are you going for the art, and where is it taking you? Now, in the poem "The Lovers," we go from misfortune, the melancart has turned over, to desperate. I've lost my property and my axe. Yet we are reassured that poetry does not need to give birth to a prince, nor must anyone understand. It will go on in the army camps, in the jade towers, in the bitter bureaucracies of eternity. It will fall from widows' hairpins. To this, I add ordinary, unqualified grief awaits, as we learn in your poem Dinner Party, alongside the balletic, a foghorn every so often from the poem Harmless Ode with Us at Mendelstam. This fall, I am giving my students what I'm referring to as the artist's rectangle, and it's going to consist of read, write, risk, however they define it, and trust. So if I'm going to give paper banners a rectangle, I guess I've got my rectangle giving out hat on today. So if I'm giving paper banners the rectangle of clarity, choreography, bereavement, and those from whom I've learned, how does your collection avail itself of that rectangle?
Well, yeah, that's fascinating, John. Poetry, I always believe, is about more than one thing at a time. And as you're pointing out with your rectangle, it can be about four things at a time. I love that multiplicious attitude that you have about it. And yeah, the more things, the merrier in a poem. I think that the poem can be influenced by others. At the same time, it can be very personal. It can be filled with terror, with courage, all of the above. I find I love my poems to be loaded because the people that I've loved in the past, like Mandelstam, for example, he was able to be very historical, but at the same time, very lyrical. One can sense all of the crises behind him as he's writing about nature. He's not unaware of the difficulty that he finds himself in. I'm not comparing myself to Mandelstam or any of the great artists who had to write under incredible duress. I'm simply saying that in my own way, I like to pack my poems and to think about the art of poetry while I am also uh, perhaps describing a narrative or describing some scene or a feeling that I have or that other people have. Just thinking in terms of how much can go into a poem. Thinking about the Ukrainians now who, under tremendous duress, people in Palestine under tremendous duress, poetry is being written in some bunker somewhere in the dark. I mean, it's uncanny how it has to go on being written because it's what gives people the lifeblood and the desire to want to live. Of course, it's not the only lifeblood and only thing that gives us the desire to live, but without art, life is much thinner and we feel less supported in our hour of need. I really believe that. And so in my own way, I try to reflect the difficulty that is in the world, even though I am admittedly a great distance from it. So
Mhm.
your rectangle, it's very inspiring because it encourages others, people that you're working with, and now me learning about it. I think it encourages people to be wide open about what can get into a piece of work.
Mhm. And I've thought a lot about the risk corner in terms of whether, and it's for an intro level workshop, it's is this something revelatory you're going to risk, or are you taking a formal risk, or are you combining the two? And then trust, it's trusting yourself as your editorial process grows, but then also trusting the feedback you're receiving, whether it's the most poem changing feedback or the most revelatory feedback, or it makes some difference, or thank you, but it's not exactly what I was looking for. Or if you happen to be like me, when you get to a certain time in a certain program, you find those two or three people who become your readers for life. And that is a completely different bar of trust. And I was lucky that I got that at Arizona.
Well, John, the other aspect of trusting the writers around you is to think about the writers who are no longer on earth, but who are all
Mhm.
around you. And you have to trust what you've learned from them as well. So it's not just the community of writers that exists in one's own programs or one's own teaching experiences, but in the long, long history behind that you've embraced as a reader of poetry.
I like that too, because you can also do that with, if you're training, for example, as I did with music, that is a nice segue into our question where you refer to a Bach cello suites, and it's in your poem Pablo Casal's Sand Dollar with embossed drawing. And the suite that I love the
Yeah.
most is his sixth in D major, because that's what I played for my graduate school auditions. Granted, the notes, they're an octave higher on the viola, and there's something about the prelude that allowed me to articulate courage, and whether that was just in the way I was phrasing it. And I've got my hand position up here, and you started off in third position with the D with the second finger to the open D string because you're doing that nice little string crossing, and you have the technique, you have the phrasing. I didn't use that piece to self-advocate. That was actually, I did do some of my own kind of, like, for lack of a better word, sticking up for myself when I got into a disagreement with a Juilliard faculty member mid-audition because he wanted to hear, it was early March. He asked for a piece I had not performed literally since, I know this to the date, September 22nd, 1999. I think it was at a concerto competition, and I second movement of Bartok viola concerto. Never in a million years were they going to ask for it, but this person did, and it was not coming back to the fingers. And I just it was like sort of a back and forth of no and yes and no and yes, and then we settled on the second movement of a Hindemith sonata that needed a little mute for it, or con sordino as it's marked. And of course, John on his audition day forgets to mute. So, but after the
Oh
mute
boy.
and the disagreement with the Juilliard faculty member, that acceptance letter still found its way to me. And even though I went to the Cleveland Institute of Music, it's nice to have that Juilliard acceptance letter. And all this leads into how you begin the Pablo Casals poem, Maestro. You exist as a shadow of sorrowful countrymen at the memory of turbulent current afloat a cello, holding fast under the bridge of a box suite. The poem concludes, Pablo pulls the sea across his body across the sea. He must use his beauty because his hands are busy. Someone is pulling threads out of God. Others cut the threads and go to war over them. Oh, the sadness of the impress of a dead hand in the sand. And just saying that, I hear the monosyllabics of that, just, and it is telegraphing the gravitas for us.
Thank you.
There's an
Yeah.
essay you wrote, Spanish Poppy, and this is in Working Time. It also has Casals, and you explain that what matters is the journey one makes between actual and virtual, artifact and symbol. This is the journey that the poet, among others, chooses, and it exists in essence, in effect. I don't think I'm different from other poets when I say I experience the language of this movement as a language of love, of concord, of transcendence, a language perhaps of strange musical instruments. What parallels do you draw between instrumentation and your volumes of work?
Oh, you're really taking me back, John, because I wrote that essay as a young woman living in Menorca, which was where Casals lived. And I'm sure you know a lot more about him than I do, but I remember that he was, of course, living in exile for many years because of the fascists, because of Franco. And that's how all of the pain gets into that poem about Casals. As far as my own work is concerned, I'm an amateur musician, and so I try to listen to the great musicians of our time and of all time, to try to learn from them. And I guess it filters into my poetry in some ways. I aspire to lyric poetry. I think it's the highest form of the art, and so in listening to musicians like Casals and to, of course, listening to him play Bach. I'm sure you're aware of the story that he would get up every morning and practice his scales using material from Bach. But anyway, I am in awe of somebody like Pablo Casals, who was not only able to continue being an artist in terribly trying times, but to celebrate art. One of his favorite things to dream about and to remind people of was the existence of the bird, the dove. And he has a very beautiful short piece. I'm sure you know it. That is, I mean, it just can make you weep either from joy or from sadness. But that's just one of the things that I hope has filtered in, however minorly, into my own writing.
There is a violinist. She's based in the UK these days, but at the height of the Cold War, 1983, Victoria Mullova defected from Russia. She and her conductor partner, Vakhtang Jordania, they gave a concert. He hadn't played piano in about 20 years, but he just was rusty enough to kind of unrust. And they defected during a recital tour. And the legend of this is she left the state-owned Stradivari on the hotel bed. They go and they check in at an
Oh my God.
embassy under the name Smith. I think she's in a blonde wig. And of course, they check in around the 4th of July when the embassy is closed. So they have to hide out in a hotel. But all of this, so because she had won the Sibelius competition in 1980, she had tied for first place with Sergei Stadler in the Tchaikovsky competition in 82. Her career wasn't going anywhere because of all of the just political.
Yeah.
She was basically stuck in Russia. So she just took this huge leap of artistic faith. And I swear the first CD she put out, or probably record, was Seiji Ozawa. It's the Sibelius Violin Concerto and the Tchaikovsky Concerto, the two pieces for which she's won these major prizes. And I swear, when you hear her, there's a high C sharp that the violinist hits in the Tchaikovsky Concerto before the development into the cadenza. It's like you can hear all of her plans. And also in the Sibelius, when you come
Mm.
out of the cadenza in the first movement, you go to these octaves, but then you switch to these fingered octaves, which is where instead of a 1-4, your fingers are 1-3 for the octave and 2 and 4. And you end on a high G. And if you hear that moment, I think it's maybe 9 minutes and 57 seconds, or maybe 8 minutes and 57 seconds into the Sibelius. She's coming out of that cadenza. The bassoon comes in with the theme, but you hear the whole. It's like you hear the entire defection plans right as she goes to those fingered octaves. And that G, it's the announcement of, okay, I'm leaving the Stradivari on the bed. So Victoria
Well, yeah,
Mullova.
you obviously your beautiful history of her life encapsulated in that crisis. It's you wouldn't wish that on your worst enemy, but it of course it often happens to the best among us. And yeah, it's a great story. It's heartwarming and it's heartbreaking.
Yeah. And there's even a YouTube documentary. It was filmed right after she defected, but it's only in the last kind of 5 years available online. But it shows her coming to America the day she leaves the I think it's Sweden where she flies out of, and she lands, and she picks up English, incrementally, and she goes on Good Morning America with, I think, Diane Sawyer, who's interviewing her, and they actually show her at one point at the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade
Oh
in
my God, the absurdity
'83.
of it all. The
I know
absurdity.
it. You hear actually Michael Jackson's Beat It way in the background. And so it's a time capsule piece. And then it's showing her as she's trying to make her career in the States and Canada. And but definitely recommend the Sibelius and Tchaikovsky, the CD that she made with Seiji Ozawa and the Boston Symphony.
Thank you. Thank
Now,
you.
another question where we toggle between working time and paper banners, given how both are richer for their references to visual art, whether it's Caravaggio's Black and Torches, Van Gogh's Almond Blossom, or this poem, Practice After Class, an anecdote about early Dutch artists is like a tree in a sieve. It makes no sense in broad daylight because they loved muted colors. When children paint the tree, perhaps they would welcome it if you play the flute at twilight. Now, in your essay reception, you write that David Hockney first came up against the problem of verisimilitude when he realized it could be technically interesting but somehow lacked vivaciousness. And then Matisse's papier découpé, literally cut paper, artworks are flat fragments floating harmoniously while Hockney's dimensional cubes fall out almost like children's blocks. The Polaroid borders are sometimes covered, sometimes retained around each photograph. Retained, the actions flow into each other with a momentary time lapse. Significantly, this causes the viewer to hook up the action to make it truly contiguous, truly moving. What are two art exhibits that had transformative impacts on you and why?
Well, you mentioned Caravaggio, and I don't know whether you would technically call these exhibits, but you're probably aware that his work is all over Rome in churches. And when I was, I don't know, maybe 19 or 20, I spent a lot of time by myself in Europe, to figure out who I was and was doing. And I would just end up trying to cool down in some of these churches in Rome. You had to put a couple of, at the time it was lira, not euros, into these little boxes so you could see his beautiful work on the wall. And I think they would, the time would be like you'd have a minute and then you'd have to put more money into these things. And I would just sit there trying to stay cool in the churches, putting money in. People would come and go. Everybody was trying to get somebody else to pay so that they could see the Caravaggio on the walls, on the church walls. But that's the first, I think, really serious artist that I, was so much more than I could ever be. I remember just being utterly overwhelmed. I don't think that's ever lost me. The sense that he was, I don't know, half crazy, maybe a murderer, destitute half his life, really, really a messed up, fucked up kind of guy who was a genius and maybe one of the greatest painters, if not the greatest painter of all time. And so to be in the presence of his work, that was an astounding experience at that time in my life. And I've gone back since then and done the same thing. It hasn't changed.
Mhm.
It's changed me, but I mean, the impact of his work on the world this just keeps growing. He's more necessary than ever. The violence in his work is something to be studied and to be changed by.
Mm.
And well, I mean, at a whole other extreme, I guess is thinking about this. Just I guess the Georgia O'Keeffe work that I saw. I'm trying to remember if it was in New Mexico. Was it Santa Fe or it must have been in Santa Fe some years ago when I was living in Taos and I found her work. Got a bunch of books about her work, but then I went to try to find some of the paintings that were available locally in museums there. And wow. She would say that her work wasn't sexual, when interviewed and in letters, but obviously, I say obviously, I mean, well, it was obvious to me that it was very erotic and intense and also very elemental. And like I said earlier, I aspire to being a lyric poet, and that kind of elemental activity, that kind of simplistic activity in a painting was very inspiring in terms of language, what could be said in a compact, crystalline way and have a large impact. She was known for taking something very simple like a stone and having it fill the entire canvas, or the front petal of a flower, and making it fill the entire gigantic canvas. And that seemed to me that somehow that could be useful to me as a writer, and that could be a lifetime's work trying to figure out how somebody of that quality, that kind of genius, could affect me, and what to do about the
So another
work.
essay of, um, from Working Time. So you've got the Madonna essay. So it makes it known that real poetic activity explodes, explores, demystifies. It is not exactly like taking the ore out of a mountain, for the power of a mountain remains in the ore. Meanwhile, homage to order with disorder in last stanza tells us, I cannot abide piety, yet passion I greatly admire. Your commentary on Madonna's video, Justify My Love, which at one point was banned by MTV. And then I remember right around the same time it was banned, little VHS versions of it were on sale at the record store. But your
Yeah,
commentary is
can't hide.
that by cutting away the caricature, the satire, there's subsequent fullness. This is the adult, and one might say the poetic experience. It's an impassioned act, removing those easy dodges. Justify, Deeper and Deeper, Borderline and Burning Up are my top Madonna videos. And then there's an appreciation that I have for the new wave band Romeo Void. It's on a separate shelf. And they have this lyric that has always stayed with me. And I heard it first in 2007. What's been paid for in misery has been brought back with luck. It's from their song Just Too Much. And that pretty much sums up my last 15 years. And then when I think about Benjamin Bassi, the late saxophonist with Romeo Void, his lines, when they are at their most disorderly, it's where his passion is the kind that's looking downwind for a monsoon, to quote the aforementioned homage. What might newer writers, and why might these newer writers lead with disorder so as to demystify and explore?
Well, not everybody has to write that way, of course. There's so many ways to get into a piece of work. I've always found it personally satisfying to have a big mess in front of me, to allow anything that I want into my first draft, and not to self criticize or censor myself. And I would recommend it, for everyone, but it isn't for everyone. Some people just want to meditate on one word, and a poem comes out of that, something very simple and pure. Uh, I guess I start the other way around. I was thinking, when you were quoting me again from some of those pieces that I wrote a number of decades ago, I was remembering how I was using the language of other art forms, like chiseling into a work, thinking of sculpture, making music, making paintings. All of those art forms made a big disorderly mess into my poetry. And so, that's how I would describe my process. I think that many people choose that because it allows you to cut back, which is I think a lot easier than adding to after a first draft. I'd rather do that, but maybe that's not for everyone. But it seems to me easier to cut than to add.
Mhm.
Inspiration comes in all kinds of forms, and sometimes it reads a little like madness at first. Maybe another way of saying disorder is that it's busy, but it's a safe space. To space of creation and of one work of art is maybe the safest space that exists on the planet. And while you're in there, you can be as disorderly as you like, as cluttered as you like, as crazy as you like, because you can control it. You're not hurting anyone, and you may be really helping someone who reads that, or who sees the final product.
And I think I remember from one of the poems in Memory at These Speeds, a Romeo Void reference.
Yes, yes. There was a while. Oh, I've got a little low battery message, John. I hope we make it. There was a time in my life when I lived in Humboldt County and I met the lead singer. I forget her name now.
Deborah Ayel.
Yeah, Deborah. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I wonder whatever happened to her. And yeah, I knew her before they were, like known. I guess if you live long enough, you meet a lot of artists. But anyway, I remember her pretty well in those. I guess we were like in the hippie days, and yeah, and of course, I then followed her music.
Yeah. I love Never Say Never. Great, great song.
Yeah.
Well, we've come to a point now where we've got two versions of your poem Idle, the early draft and then the published version. So through the magic of shared screen, we will look at the early draft first. And if you could read it for us.
Oh, you want me to read the earlier draft? Okay, I've got
Sure.
it here too on
Okay.
my own screen. Um, okay, here's the first draft. It's not that different, but I hope the small changes made a big difference. On huge load flowers, the mind carries a spirit on its bamboo mat, threaded with gold. It mingles with refugees. It is true, our people left behind fields of hemp and citrus. Their sweat fell as rain until a different season brought a chill. Someone has chiseled titles and praises, but we are not included. Even if heaven is deep blue and endless, it cannot explain our wild love, saved in an alphabet of moss. An ode about crossing a pond or an ode with an obstacle cannot engrave our virtues. They remain like ancestors buried with the days. I'm embarrassed to go out among so many in a hurry. I trim the lamp's smoking wick. I take off my clothes. The fumes of wine and blossoms are by nature fleeting. In cold weather, they lose their fragrance. Although I have studied poems, I only now notice they are not about farewell. In exchange for giving up land, the refugee sought a boat and a tent, but only received a decree. It is still a perilous time. The nobles will regret it. Although my flute is quiet, my senses have not deteriorated. Yes, I've been too lazy to wash my hair. If the situation permits, you may ask about the spirit, fragrant as incense or steeping tea. In the desert, shy of 40 years, inconstant but familiar, I've had to acknowledge it as if I had time to time eaten a sacred mushroom, the beauty of form.
Eight. And then we'll get to the published version, another magical screenshot of sharing. Let's see.
Okay.
And
Um, so here's the finished, or as finished as I could get it version. Idle. As the immortals used to ride on huge lotus flowers, the mind ferries a spirit on its bamboo mat, carried as a refugee carries water in a bucket on her head, until its bottom breaks through. In a moment of bliss, a few precious mementos, one's smile, one's youth, pass nimbly through the universe. It's true, our people left behind fields of hemp and citrus, threaded with gold. Their sweat fell as rain, until a different season brought a chill. Time has chiseled titles and praises, but we are not included. Even if heaven is deep blue and endless, it cannot explain our wild love, saved in an alphabet of moss. The past cannot engrave its virtues. They remain as our ancestors, buried with the days. I'm embarrassed to go out among so many in a hurry. I trim the lamp's smoking wick. I take off my clothes. The fumes of wine and blossoms are by nature fleeting. In cold weather, they lose their fragrance. Although I've studied poems, I only now notice they are not about farewell. In exchange for giving up land, the refugees sought a boat and a tent, but only received a decree. It is still a perilous time. The aristocrats will regret it. Although my flute is quiet, my senses have not deteriorated. Yes, I've been too lazy to wash my hair or stamp my papers as the situation permits. Apprentices may ask about a spirit perfumed as incense or steeping tea. Just shy of life, you will be alive again in a shape of fruitful meditation, like a beloved fig tree that follows you into exile. As if I had from time to time eaten a sacred mushroom, Even if your boat returns empty because of a storm, I have to acknowledge it, the beauty of form.
Nice. What were some of the
So yeah,
revisional?
they're the same and different. I resisted against talking in the plural, although I do in the second draft do it a little bit. But there was a moment in the first draft I realized I need to be more specific about who I'm talking about. So I've got somebody carrying water on her head. Instead of generalizing in the plural, I had a very specific figure, and then I had to figure out who I was writing to, and I think I hope I clarified that a little bit. I think it became more of a love poem. I'll just say that about somebody who wouldn't return. Um, and just thinking about, gosh, I guess again, I'll just repeat what I said earlier. I was really influenced by the quiet around me, and trying to find some beauty in the silence that was at the same time dangerous. I hope that poem reflects and came more to reflect that quiet and at the same time a sense of history and of tragedy, that one has when one thinks about one's ancestors and all of the ancestors, not just the ones that one is related to. After all, the history of humanity has been a history of grotesque violence, and somehow I to make beauty out of what is often a cruel world.
Hmm. Speaking of beauty, you have apricots and jade that are among the motifs in paper banners, and I just love that long A and jade, and the there's like a luxury to that letter J, and the D, such a softness to it. And then it's either the apricots like April, so two long A's there, and then the ah of cots. So those are some of the motifs that we're coming across in the book. Though some of my earliest annotations centered around moments in the poems where I found references to gentleness. There's this one early on: the cape curves along a salty bay gently, with that little trinity of Y's there: saltly, bay, gently. Then we have the healing power of a flower is a dream of a gentle stone. There's also in the full moon's light on an empty bed, the white geese and firefly glow dissolve. We vanished as gently as snowfall on a face. And then the opening of your poem, Jasmine in a Foreign Country, which I had the awesome opportunity when I was doing the Community of Writers anthology in 2020. That's a poem of yours that we published in that. And
Yeah.
starts in a car with a flat tire. I wouldn't stop to change. You thought better to plug and inflate it, then miss our destination altogether. Then you touched me in the sea air gently, as the princess under whose mattress lay the pea, as a reminder of the majesty of a gesture. In what ways did gentleness bring you to paper banners, and how does it influence your work beyond?
Well, I suppose, John, I am not only aspire to lyric poetry, but to love poetry. And I suppose I've tried to be someone who learns how to love all her life. And I think it seeps into my poetry that I have strong feelings and that I'm quite emotional and that I've been, thinking about love and all kinds of love, not just sensual or erotic love, but spiritual love and so on. It's a preoccupation of mine to get that into my work somehow, to try to make a seam of love through the difficult world that we live in. And so maybe that was heightened during the pandemic because as you know, that book was written then. And yeah, I don't know. The gentleness that's in my work comes out of a feeling of love toward others and the love that I've received in my life. I feel like I'm a very lucky person to have had so much love, complicated love often, but and I suppose in the end it drives my work.
Nice. Stand in the rain or not, never to splash in a fountain or swim in a sea. This is a poem that addresses Gertrude Stein in its first stanza.
Yeah.
Alice B. Toklas stamping her foot on the portrait of Madame Cézanne in stanza two. I'm going to segue to an excerpt of Stein's published lecture, Poetry and Grammar. Another poet who I read during the pandemic finally got around to Tender Buttons. But this is from when she was on the lecture circuit. And the handy dandy Norton anthology from which I teach has graciously put this together. So thank you, Norton Anthology. But she says, what had periods to do with it? Inevitably, no matter how completely I had to have writing go on, physically, one had to again and again stop sometime. And if one had to again and again stop some time, then periods had to exist. Besides, I had always liked the look of periods and I liked what they did. Then periods have a life of their own, a necessity of their own, a feeling of their own, a time of their own. And this brings us into paper banners because there's a mix of poems with and without punctuation. And one of the smaller unpunctuated poems that has just stuck with me ever since I've read it, it's Roadhouse, which is this sensorial tableau. You could hear a hairpin hit the straw until the sun shot through a window, doing her a favor she didn't take a liking to. All was forgiven when, after a ginned up group picture, they tore into a roast chicken. I'm just loving the fact that there could be some chicken skin in a poem here. Perhaps punctuation sat this one out so we could take the photo, reminding us of what a sentence can literally capture. How did you decide which poems would enter your book with commas and periods while others went free of them?
Perhaps the more musical a poem was, the less I felt it needed to be punctuated. And uh, I really would have loved to have no punctuation at all. I mean, I think that I aspire to that, but sometimes if it's a long narrative or if it's more conversational or rhetorical, then it probably needs some help. The purest music in a poem, that should guide a poem, ideally, and not need any punctuation. But it's difficult to maintain that kind of level of vowel and consonant music down the page to guide the reader. So often my poems would kind of fold down and back, and that needs help sometimes. I'm not writing a simple through line that's easy to follow. So I want to try to help my reader. I know that I'm not an easy poet to read on the best of days, and so if I can help with a little punctuation, I add it. But I would aspire and especially in lyric poetry, not to need it. I'm actually writing poems now that desperately need punctuation. They're more like prose poems, and they couldn't exist without it. So I really think it has to do with the kind of music that is inside the poem and how maybe short the lines are as well. That sometimes helps a reader move down the page without any stops.
And if you're in a roadhouse, sometimes punctuation just needs to stay at the door, right? I I'm just so taken
Leave
with
it,
this
leave it
poem.
outside. Park it with.
Yeah, check off valet, right? Well,
Yeah.
thank you again for your time and insights, Jane. Gratitude as always for the workshop at Arizona. And then when our paths crossed again in 2019 at Community of Writers, your last line of the bell slurs and the blowing spray, but once adrift, work is work. This connected with me more so than the chicken skin and Roadhouse. But once adrift, work is work. It connects because I'm still parsing my relationship to the working adrift. So thank you for that. Is there another poem you'd like to read from Paper Banners or a different collection?
I think I'll read one that I've been working on. I have a new book that I've been working on, tentatively called. Well, the title is the title of every poem in the book, and that title is "The Elusive Pursuit of Happiness."
Mm.
So this poem opens many centuries ago with a Chinese poet, and describes a bit of his life, but really I would hope that it would speak to our own time as well. So here it is. The Elusive Pursuit of Happiness. Across the great Pacific, Zhang Yang Ho slinks from his desk in a rickshaw hat, trimmed like a tasseled lampshade and tied under his chin. Demoted and dismissed for criticizing late imperial China. He went on to work himself sick, helping the drought-stricken Yellow River farmers 7 centuries ago. All my life seems like yesterday morning, he sang, in a vulgar song of foreigners in alleyways. To live in bliss is to be seized by voices and be shown the spirit of a thing is inexhaustible. To live in a fascist society is to understand that saying yesterday was fresh as cherries in a pit-stained paper bag really means that bombed strangers are bleeding out in hospitals. Censorship is the violence of the state and of the self.
Wow. So I enjoyed it. Thank you for sharing that poem and the cherry image. So we go from the apricots to the cherries. We're just getting the grand tour of all the fruits that we should be eating for better nutrition in this day and age.
Listen, John, one of the great art forms is the culinary art form. And not that I'm a great chef, but I do enjoy eating. And I think one writes about what's in one's world. And in my world, I like to fill my world when I can with music and good food and good friends. And I hope that filters into my work.
Nice. And so this is your upcoming project, and do you feel now that you've had a geographic relocation that is there a new way of looking at obviously like a new way of looking at the backyard since you're in a different backyard, but how is that factoring into your work or
Not yet, but I hope so, John. I would think so. My gosh. Beauty all around, but very different from the desert that I lived in for so long. I'm in the Pacific Northwest where it's just emerald green. And everywhere I turn, as I mentioned earlier, I'm in a park, and everywhere I look, there are giant trees. I don't know if this makes any sense in my little
it
uh,
does?
iPhone, but thank you for asking. If it has affected my work, I hope it will. I haven't really unpacked yet, so we'll see what happens. I
Yeah,
thank you for asking.
sure. Well, and it's been so enjoyable to reconnect, and I've enjoyed all the Jane Miller poems that I've read, and I now have some Jane Miller prose that I can go to. And again, thank you. I remember
Thank you.
so many people from my cohorts from that 2013-14 year and 2014 into 15, we were, I think, your last MFA poetry workshop. And I remember you paired us up. We had two people that you would do.
Yeah,
I think you
there.
did some really amazing literary explorations and conversations in the first half of the workshop, and then we would go to the two people that we were paired, the two pairs that were in the workshop. And
Hmm.
it seems like only, I mean, it was 11 years ago, but it still stays with you. So
I'm glad. I'm glad, and I wish you all the best with your own work. It's just a pleasure to see you, and I look forward to seeing you soon again. Who knows where, John? Right? We never know these
right,
things.
right. Well, thank you,
Take good
Jane.
care. Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Take good care. Bye bye
Bye.
now.
Bye.